Camellia and Key sit in front of the fire in silence. She lets out a breath, huddling into her knees as she stares into the flames. Watching the ember gutter and sizzle as a drop of water creams down onto it. Key, who was kneeling behind her, poked the fire with a stick he'd picked up. Even though they'd agreed to talk, both of them found it hard to. She didn't know what to say, and even if she did, she didn't know if she should say it. After a moment of prolonged silence, he shifted, his jaw clacking as he began to speak. "If you don't want to talk, it's okay. You can just go back to sleep." "I'm not tired. I'm actually really awake right now." The wooden boy cradles his knees close, looking at her as she talks. After a moment, he raises an eyebrow. "Don't humans need to sleep, though?" "Yes, we do. But sometimes people can't sleep when they feel troubled." "Oh, okay." The boy ceases his prodding of the fire, spinning his head to look at her. His gaze flickered across her face, almost like he was searching for whatever she was feeling. "Camellia, I have a question." "Yeah?" "I remember you mentioning the world outside is complicated. Why is it that way, if you don't mind me asking?" It's hard to explain. Does it have something to do with the Herald?" "Who is he?" Camellia immediately freezes up, trembling as soon as the title is mentioned. "You can tell me. I can handle a lot more than you think." The fire crackled between them, punctuating the silence with pops and hisses. Finally, Camellia let out a breath. "He's my father. Lucien's too." "Oh, he must be a good person then, since you two are so—" "He is not good! By Nile, he's barely even a person!" He shrinks back at her interruption. The woman pauses, then growls to herself at her own annoyance, forcing her shoulders to relax. "Sorry, I'm bad at this. I just have a complicated relationship with my father. A lot of people do. Especially Lucien." "Why?" "Because to him, his father is a god amongst men." She furrowed her brows, straining to collect her thoughts before continuing. "To everyone, he's a god amongst men. And for both me and Lucien, you can imagine the type of shoes that we have to fill. Horrid, rotted, worm-eaten shoes that have no business being placed in front of us." Biting her lip, she fiddles with the edge of her blouse. He gently hands her the stick, and she takes it with a smile. She begins to poke the fire before continuing. "The world is complicated because of pressure. A lot of it. It's such bullshit. The thought that people are like pieces of coal you can turn into diamonds with just enough of a clenched fist. That's why what Lucien and MICHAELA said is wrong." "What exactly did they say?" The statement that you need to just keep moving even when you're hurting. Yes, it's right to keep living, but what they described isn't life, it's survival. My mother worked herself to the bone for me and Lucien, and she put up with the worst of everything we could have gone through because of that belief. With a grunt, she chucks the stick into the fire, watching as it is eaten up by the heat. "Now I know, after all we've been through in the past week even, it's wrong. How am I supposed to help if I'm not even giving myself time to breathe? And..." Camellia trails off, before letting out a grunt as she rubs her face. "Sorry. A lot's been on my mind." "No, I understand. I'm not sure why, but I do. It just Reminds me of my brother, maybe. I don't know much about him, but I'm presuming he didn't just spawn into existence. He knows that people are outside, so he couldn't have always been here. Wouldn't he have told you about Holidor? He looks at the fire again, rocking on his feet back and forth as he thinks of an answer. Yeah. I don't know. He's very secretive. The boy opens up the door on his stomach, letting out a sigh of relief as a stick spawns. He picks it up, holding it gingerly in his hand before using it to tousle the firewood. He told me about most things, but I don't know if they actually apply to anything real. I've never even heard of the Harolds. Well, most people worth their salt know him as Mephisto. He pauses as rocking. Mephisto? Do you know him? No, I don't. It only sounds familiar. Maybe Tobias mentioned him once. But if he's really your father, I'd wonder why my brother would know him. I don't know, maybe he's been here once, but he's never mentioned it. I don't know. What is he like? He wasn't really around enough to get a personable account of him. But the best way I can describe him is pressure. Power. After that statement, it went silent. She inhaled, furrowing her brows as she turned over the thought in her head. Mind drifting back to the elusive man he spoke of so often. Speaking of power, I was wondering something. What color is your brother's hair? That's an odd question. It's red, kinda crimson, like mine. Why? Camellia finally turns, looking right at him. Her eyebrows knit together as her mouth hung open slightly. What? Nothing. I think I'm just getting a bit tired, is all. She lets out a grunt as she gets up, walking over and bringing Key into a hug. Good night, Bambino. Remember to put the fire out. Got it. After a half an hour of waiting, the boy glances at the group. Camellia was curled up next to Michaela, pressed up against her back. He smiles slightly, gaze softening. He grabs his cloak, taking it off and putting it on them both. I guess this is what having friends is like. With that, he lets out a puff of air before turning towards Lucien. The man was curled up in a fetal position, the boat held close to his chest. Key frowns with concern. I wonder if he knows that. The wooden boy turns to the darkness, the edges of firelight making the motley mixture of rock and obsidian glow. He saw something dark in the murkiness, a solid form slithering across the ground like a snake. His fist tightened slightly, eyes widening by a centimeter. Hello? A golden glow gradually begins to flicker down the cavern. Key bites his lip before turning back to his friends, hesitating to move. Then he slowly stands to his feet, dungarees creasing against his spindly form. His joints creak, but it wasn't enough to drown out the telltale sound of rustling further down the cave. With another creak of his joints, he circles around the camp and heads into the darkness. As things went murky, he blinks, fishing around his door and grabbing a lantern. It was silent. Too silent. The cave's surfaces were oddly bare, but he could still hear shifting in the distance. The further he got, the louder the noises were. Anxiety crawled up his back. The varnished wood that made up his meticulously carved form crackling with energy. Where are those things? What's making that noise? Immediately he went quiet with a hush. Vines, shambling and shifting around each other like a web around the walls of the cave. They stretch up the sides of the rock like a weaving mass of veins, slithering into the cracks in slow streams of constant movement. He stammered, stepping back in horror. An appendage from the mass wriggled across the floor, grabbing onto his leg like a man dying of thirst. He slammed his foot down onto it quickly and smashed it into a sappy pulp. I need to get rid of these before... Ceasing his panic, he turns, brandishing his lantern with as much determination as he could muster. Get ready, and... The water of morning drips down from the ceiling of the cave, hitting the stone floor with a quiet plop. It was dimmer than last night, the fire having gone out in the throes of their sleep. The only things lighting up the cavern were the leftover cinders and flickering torches affixed to the walls. Stirring slightly, Lucien yawns, eyes squeezing as he groaned from the ache of his bones. A droplet of cave water hit his cheek, making him flinch. He shivered, slowly getting up from his makeshift bed and looking around. His eyes, sleep-crusted and watery, blurred his surroundings into a slurry of orange and dark blues. Camellia was curled next to MICHAELA, drooling onto the cave floor as she tucked her arms over her abdomen. MICHAELA looked haggard, but seemed to be sleeping peacefully regardless. He wondered if they had any good dreams. Frowning at the thought, he sighed, rubbing his eyes. Do you want to go for a walk with me, Key? I figured we could kill the time until... It was uncharacteristically silent. Usually the boy would have interrupted him with a chirped out yup by now. Lucien looked around, eyes widening fractionally. Key? His voice echoed off the empty walls, bouncing back toward him mockingly. A drop of sweat beads on his forehead, anxiety pooling in his lungs as he breathed out tempered air. He shakingly stood up, his dress shirt crumpled and wavy, and hair strung about his face like a frayed cloth. He shuffled past the camp, shadows streaking across the cave. The man's amber eyes darted around as he walked into the cavern. Key? This isn't funny. Is that you? You can come out now. Key? The horrifying sight stands in front of him, the image of his friend strung to the ceiling in a state of inanimacy. Thorny vines cradling him like a child's coffin. Key's blue eyes were dull, a crack coming up his arm. No, Key! With a start, Camellia and MICHAELA woke up, hearing Lucien's startled screams from the clearing. They run out towards him, both panting with fear before they see the blood-chilling sight before them. Lucien hunched over the vines, heavily breathing as he clawed at them with hands outstretched. Bits of ambrosial nectar and rot drip onto his pale skin, sizzling against it as he lets out guttural sobs. Let him go! Before they can reach in to help, his eyes glow golden, rage written on his lips as he screams. Ah! In an instant, the vines began to wither as liquid rot traveled up their tendrils, the flesh around its inner structure corroding and becoming toxic in an instant. However, Camellia snatches his arm before he can completely dissolve them. Lucien, stop! I can control it! No, you can't! You're going to— She slams against the ground as he pushes her off. MICHAELA rushes to her side, looking her over with worry. Lucien, you're going too far! MICHAELA quickly looks up, seeing the man with his hands on the floor. He spits out blood as his gaze travels down.
What?
Lucien looks down at his abdomen and sees a rotted, toxic vine stabbed through his stomach. He puts his palm against the wound, sweat pouring on his forehead. His blood is blackened as if it had been infected by a plague. Lucien's eyes roll back into his skull and he falls over, fingers twitching as his blood pools on the stone floor. The vines slowly pull back, beginning to shake and then shrivel with the taste of his blood. As they shrink, Key finally falls from the ceiling, the light returning to his eyes as he shivers, their blue hue briefly flashing gold. Camellia screams, running to her brother in a panic. She turns to MICHAELA as she clutches onto Lucien's arm. Get the herbs! Kayla rushes over to the bag, hands shaking as she grabs at the herbs and begins to look through them, then back at the wound. With a grunt, Camellia opens up his vent and lifts his shirt slightly, seeing his veins beginning to go sickly obsidian around the injury. She feels sick, trying to hold it closed so he doesn't bleed out. The wooden boy rushes over as soon as he catches his bearings, confused but nonetheless willing to help as he struggles to get a mortar and pestle out for her. When he manages to make it appear, she grabs it and shakingly puts the herbs in, grinding them together. Lucien, it's going to be all right, okay? Okay? Mom is back home, okay? You're going to see her soon. You just need to hold tight. I'm sorry. It's my fault. It's my fault. A lump lodges itself into Camelia's throat as MICHAELA applies the poultice, the toxin in his veins beginning to stabilize. Camellia takes in a breath, hovering her hand over the wound. Her eyes once again glow as she forces herself to calm down, and before she knows it, tears are dripping down her cheeks. The wound begins to slowly close, blackness of his veins receding slowly. Though still, his face was covered in sweat. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No, it's not your fault. It's mine. I'm such an awful sister. Please forgive me. Tears came to her eyes as she said this, but Lucien didn't seem to recognize what she was saying, simply muttering his sorries. Next to them, he stood there, shell-shocked. But he quickly shook his head. He needs shelter and rest. He grabs Lucien, lifting him up. Come on! The two women nod, following behind. They help him carry the man through the cave, hurrying across the cavern and hoping for the sight of dawn. Seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, Key hoists up Lucien with a grunt of effort and runs to the exit. As they breach the cave, they enter the gates of a barren town. It was seemingly superimposed onto the cave's form, the gates built into the end of the stone. The sun was rising, but not enough to lighten the streets. Every inch of the desolate village was awash with dark, hazy blue. The group searched around, then rushed into the first building they see, a stone church with large wooden doors. Camellia starts to hear the whispers, looking outside to see the golden specters wandering the streets, muttering to themselves. She quickly shuts the wooden doors and barricades them. Letting out a heavy breath, her gaze shifts up to see Key set Lucien down on a pew, holding the man's hand and squeezing gently. This isn't your fault, Camellia. It's mine. I heard something in the distance and got curious. I was the one who decided to follow it. No, it's mine. I'm his sister. I'm the one who should make sure he doesn't do these— But you told me to protect him! Yeah, but I was supposed to protect him first! It's neither of your faults. Now, will you two stop squabbling and self-flagellating? I have a patient that needs treating. The two of them wince, looking at each other, then back at MICHAELA. Sorry. MICHAELA scoffs at this and turns toward Lucien. who was shivering like he'd been doused in cold water. If you're so worried, then make yourself useful and get a cold compress for him. He's fighting off poison for Niall's sake. She shoots a glare at the two of them when they don't immediately leave. They skulk off, not looking at each other as they walk through the back halls of the church. Camellia looks around the stony walls, then pauses, squinting as a golden light hits her face. Her gaze travels up, going completely silent as she sees a stained glass portrait across the hall. A muscular man with a smile that seemed almost saintly, long green hair splayed out like unfurled wings, and a golden apple in his hands. Her fists clenched tightly at the sight. "What's wrong?" He looks up toward the window, eyebrows creasing tightly. "That person. Do you know them?" It's not important." He looks at her, closing his mouth tightly. "I may be young, but I'm not stupid. I know you're hiding something." "Look, it's really not." "Is that your father?" She inhales sharply, looking at the ground with shame. "Camellia." "Yes." He looks at the stained glass portrait, before going to a water faucet on the side of the hall. "I don't know if this is true, of course, but Tobias told me about deities." Camellia refuses to meet his gaze, averting her eyes as she goes silent. He glances back at her before turning the faucet. Is your father a god?" I promise I'm nothing like him. I don't even like him." "Why would I think you're like him? Just because he's your dad doesn't make you him. I know I'm not like Tobias because he's my brother." He pulls out a bucket, letting the water pour in. You're right." She pulls off her ribbon, giving it to Key. The sharp ears from her heritage protrude out from her hair, and she instinctually tries to hide them. But they're as plain as the sun in the light of dawn. I'm just used to it." He gratefully takes the cloth, dipping it down into the bucket as he wets the fabric. "Well, for what it's worth, I don't see you any differently." They both look at their reflections in the water. The woman sees herself staring back, eyes wide and brown, skin covered in cave dirt, and frizzy hair the same seafoam green it always was. And next to her, she sees Key, bright-eyed, kind, warm. "I just see Camellia, my best friend." He keeps dousing the ribbon in water, then brings it up to wring it out, trying to make a cold compress for Lucien. Upon hearing Camellia begin to cry, Key pivots back towards her, fretting as he stammers. "Oh, Criminy! I didn't mean to make you cry. No, it's okay. I know I'm happy. I don't know why I'm crying so much." She hiccups and he brings her into another hug. "It's okay. You can cry." She nods into his shoulder, still sobbing. After 30 minutes of calming her down, Key walks her back. Camelia's eyes are reddened from the tears, but she tries her best to look presentable. Key has his hand on her shoulder, frowning to himself as he looks over at Michaela, who is still tending to Lucien. His face was sickly pale. He seemed to have finally fallen asleep, his breath shallow and steady. She turns towards them, then gratefully takes the cloth, setting it down on his forehead. Is he gonna be okay?" "Seems so. He just needs a day of rest tomorrow. That means no traveling. Whatever will be best for him." She looks towards the front door of the church, still hearing the whispers of the specters outside. "I'm a bit worried about all the weird things happening. I don't know if staying still would be best for us." "We may not have a choice. If If we need anything, then we'll go out in twos, with one person here to take care of Lucien, preferably me. Camellia opens her mouth, as if to protest, then nods, gulping before looking down at her hands. You're the boss. Even if things are different, I still know Calphos pretty well. Don't worry, you won't get lost with me. After giving a smile to him, Camellia sits down on the pew, looking at her brother with concern. His eyebrows were furrowed, ears twitching as he mumbles out incoherent words in Rosalinian. Things are different. She looks to the circular window on the steeple of the church. The stained glass depicts two stars intertwined, shards of glass striking through them to make their stardust fall. MICHAELA. The one who remains nameless stares out from behind a column, then floats to look closer at the four. Their wide, red eyes blink. In their obscured, incorporeal state, they whisper out again, two voices intermingling into one. MICHAELA Klein? MICHAELA slowly looks up, giving them a stern glare. The apparition simply returns her gaze with an empty stare, head tilting slightly, before turning away and floating into another hall of the church. Their hazy body floats like a fog before a storm. Pausing, they look up to see the twin stars, red eyes softening before rounding the corner. Patiently, they wait, as they always have. Then, they see her shadow in the candlelight. At long last, minutes or decades in this perilous moment, she stands before them, her arms crossed, spectacles shining in the firelight. This better be quick. How are you? Tired, but I'm trying my best to do what you asked. The nameless one floats around, shade gathering around their body and showing the skin underneath. MICHAELA looks down at it before asking the question, who are you? No one. You keep asking every time. And I'll keep asking until I get an answer, ghost. The answer is? MICHAELA's head perks up. Beyond your comprehension. With that response, MICHAELA scowls as she rolls her eyes, letting out a huff and tapping her foot on the ground. Please just lead him to the truth. This cannot go on much longer. Fine, I will. I'm grateful for you giving me a second chance. I promised I would repay the favor, so I will make sure to do it. But after all this, what do you want? I want this farce to end. Time is not on humanity's side. I asked what you wanted. A name. I hope you find one eventually. With a clack of her heels, the woman walks off, leaving the ghost to stand in the moonlight. They look up at the stained glass picture of Mephisto, fist clenching and shaking as the shadow dissipates, revealing a twinned entity of flesh and shade. They let out a breath, their long hair flowing with the glow of a purple ember. Both of us, do too. The night's wind brushed Tobias's red curls as he stared out the window. His eyes were open wide, clutching at his knees with one arm. His other hand tugged at a stray strand of hair. He didn't blink, shivering as he watched the outside with bated breath. Next to him, a vine crawled up the window, to which he immediately slammed his fist down onto it. The sap splattered onto his hand with a squelch, staining his knuckles with golden honey.
They'll be here soon. Just be patient.
The man perked up, hearing the sound of glass clinking together outside. He shook his head, looking out the window to see two figures shuffling up to his door. Scrambling to his feet, he dashed toward the front of his home, undoing several locks before yanking the door open.
Thank goodness! Is something the matter? I'm not sure. I was hoping you'd tell me.
You know we'd be aware of just as much as you are. Tobias lets out a breath, walking back into the house and pacing. The two shorter figures stood in the doorway, watching him through their cloaks. Finally, one sighed, shaking their head softly. What exactly do you need us to do?
Just go on your normal route, but I need you to go through the town first. That town?
And you're sure about that?
Yes, please. It's important that this is done.
The two scouts turned their heads slightly, glancing at each other in the darkness of the cottage. They then nod, turning around to leave Tobias alone. He stared after them, eyes wide with fear. Finally, he slowly shuts the door.